Well, good morning. We are in the month of January. It's the first month of a new year where we make those commitments. We think about things we want to accomplish in the upcoming year. We make plans for growth. And one of the ways in which we want to grow is spiritually. And so if you haven't been with us the last couple of weeks, we've been in a series called Habits of the Heart. What are those personal habits of the heart that help us to grow spiritually? A couple weeks ago, we talked about prayer, and we saw Jesus teaching that prayer doesn't have to be complicated, and what a relief that can be. Last week, very similarly, we looked at Bible reading, and that Bible reading doesn't have to be overly complicated. We had the challenge to show up to read just one word a day. I won't ask for a show of hands for how many people did that this past week, but personally, one word a day is a lot more achievable of a goal than reading like 5 chapters a day or trying to get through the Bible in a year. But when we show up to read that one word, it is super helpful. It changes our life. That's another great habit of the heart. This morning, we want to talk about worship. So we talked about prayer, talked about Bible reading. This morning, we're going to talk about worship, how worship is a habit of the heart that helps us to grow spiritually. Let me open with this question. What day of the week is the day of worship? Okay. I heard some Sundays, that's good. I don't know if I heard it or not, but maybe some people would say Saturday. In some religious traditions, Saturday might be the day of worship. We typically think of Sunday as the day of worship. But the reality is, and some of you caught it, so good job. It's actually a trick question because every day is the day of worship. And I want to follow that up with a very bold statement. Don't leave. Hear me out. Let me cook. Worship is not about God. Worship is not about God. Worship is not an exclusively Christian concept because worship is simply an active response to the perceived value of something. Worship is something that we do when we see something that has value, and then we actively respond to the value that we see that it has. Worship is an active response to the perceived value of something. And that's why worship is something that happens every day of the week. Because we all worship something with our lives every single day of the week. Because we all value certain things and we respond to them. We actively respond to the things that we value, and we value things that impact us every day of the week, not just on Sunday, not just on Saturday, but it's something that happens continuously. For example, one thing that we value, most of us in this room probably value, is that we value not being broke. And so because we value not being broke, we actively respond by getting up and going to work. In a way that is an act of worship, it is an active response to the perceived value of something. We value not being broke, therefore, we make a determined, committed effort to get up and go to work so we can get a paycheck. We value how others perceive us. And so, if we tell a friend that we're going to meet them for coffee and the breakfast, and the alarm goes off, we don't feel like getting up because we value how other people perceive us, we get up and we follow through in that commitment. We actively respond to the value of how other people would respond. We don't want to let them down. We value friendships. And so maybe as a student we go to school, even though every other part of the school day is something that we do not like, we are willing to get up and go to school because at least we get to see our friends. We are actively responding to the value that we have placed upon friendship. As parents, we value investing in the next generation. And so we spend thousands of hours and thousands of dollars on raising up our kids. We value perhaps identity as a Swiftie, and so we spend thousands of dollars going to the Eras tour. We worship something that we think is valuable, and why and how we think it's valuable causes us to actively respond to it. Worship is not just about God. Worship is something that happens all the time because we value a whole number of different things. The problem is that all of those things can disappoint. The problem is that a job can let you go. Your friends can move on to different friendships. Maybe we value pleasure and we actively respond by planning a vacation, but then the vacation is over, and now what? We value other people's perception. and we can't control that. We spend all that money on that concert ticket, and then the experience is over, and we don't have much to show for it. The problem with worshiping all those things, the problem with actively responding to all those things we value, is that at some point they will eventually disappoint. Now, maybe at some point in our life, we hear about God, and we think, maybe God deserves a little bit of worship too. The reality is that God deserves the biggest worship. If we are going to actively respond to anything, to anyone, God deserves the most worship. He is the most valuable thing. He deserves the biggest aspect, the biggest expression of our worship. But what most of us tend to do is we tend to put worship of God into the smallest of boxes. And we compartmentalize it, and we think about worship as singing songs on Sunday morning. And as a Christian, when we hear the word worship, what we think of is 20 minutes a week. We have this weird separation. God deserves more worship, bigger worship than anyone else, and yet we tend to limit it so small. We think of worship in a very, very small way. But friends, God deserves our biggest worship. What I want each one of us, myself included, to be convinced of this morning is this truth, that God deserves our biggest worship. We want to look at why He does, and after we are convinced that He deserves our biggest worship, then we want to together consider how to express that and how that is something that is way beyond 20 minutes on a Sunday morning. But that worship is something that we do with all of our lives. In order to be convinced of the why and also to see the how, we're going to look at Psalm 96. If you have your Bible, I invite you to turn there. Psalm 96, among many other places in the Bible, documents both the why and the how. Psalm 96 was literally a song that was written by David several thousand years ago, and like many songs, a psalm has verses and a chorus. It has a pattern, it has a theme, and so you see the structure of Psalm 96 is that there are four distinct parts. The first three verses describe the how, describe what it looks like to worship God, how to respond to Him. Verses 4 through 6 are the why, and then it goes back to the how, and then the very end of the psalm talks about the why. So right here in this one psalm, we have both the why God deserves our biggest response and also how to do that, what that looks like. So we're going to walk through that together. We're going to start with the why, so we're going to jump into verse 4. Psalm 96, verse 4 says this, "For great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. He is to be feared, He is to be respected, He is to be valued above all lowercase g gods." Why? "For all the gods of the people are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens." The Lord made the heavens. All the gods of the people are worthless idols. See, back in that day, back in David's day, most other religions that were around were literally constructed around worshiping an object that was made out of stone, out of wood, out of precious metals, and all of those objects were made. Someone had to make them. Someone made that image, made that figurine, and then people would worship it, and they would give it credit for bringing the rains for the harvest, or for causing the sun to shine, or for helping their families to grow. They would worship this object that had been made, but David is pointing out, he's saying the Lord made the heavens. The Lord made everything. Everything else that can be worshiped is something that has been made, but our God made everything. He made the wood and the rock and the precious metal that those idols were made out of. He made everything beyond that. He made every single thing that we see. If there's anyone who is greatly to be praised, let us worship the one who made everything as compared to things that have been made. Everything else in our world today that we might worship, that we might pay attention to, that we might respond to is something that has been made, but God made the heavens. That's a huge reason why we ought to worship Him. Verse 6 gives us some more. "Splendor and majesty are before Him. Strength and beauty are in His sanctuary." This word "before" means that they are in front of Him. They are in His presence. That when we think about splendor and majesty, when we think about strength and beauty, we literally can't think about those things without associating them with God. They literally belong to him. They come from him. If you want to get the best picture of the most splendor, the most majestic thing, the strongest thing, the most beautiful thing, you literally have to go and gaze at God's presence. That comes before him. It is in front of him. It is in his presence. Everything else that we might think of as strong or as beautiful or as majestic is simply a cheap imitation of the real thing. Like ordering off of Temu instead of Amazon. Verse 13, jumping to the end, gives us another reason why to worship him, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. Now this verse probably hits a little different. Talked about splendor and majesty and God making everything, and all those things might invoke a sense of joy and appreciation, of thankfulness, and then we see judgment, and we think, ooh, that feels a little different. And if that feels a little uncomfortable or a little intimidating, well, it should, because we are imperfect people. And the thought of being judged based on what we have done, that should be a little intimidating. However, but secondly, God is fair. God is a judge who judges the world in his righteousness, meaning he judges rightly. He is faithful. He is a fair judge. He is not like the referees in a Chiefs game. He actually gives a fair chance, and he looks at things fairly. Amen in the back. There you go. God is a righteous judge. And so judgment should feel a little intimidating. It should feel a little scary, but then we can find a little bit of hope and recognizing that he judges fairly. But then the most mind-blowing aspect of all that can give us hope, even in the midst, even facing this word judgment, is that God has also provided the rescue from that judgment. This week, as I was chewing on this concept, I thought of this book, The Little Red Caboose. It's one of my favorite books as a kid growing up. It's a book that I subsequently read to my own kids. And if you're not familiar with the story of the Little Red Caboose, it's about a caboose, which would be at the back of the train. And as the story goes, in this particular town, the children would come out and they would love to watch the train go by. And they would all come out for the big, strong, shiny black engines that would come thundering past and smoke coming out. The children would wave and get excited and watch the big black engines. And then they would stay as the tank cars and the coal cars and the box cars and all the other train cars went past. And they would watch that and they would listen to the sound. But the trains were long. And eventually the kids would get bored. And you couldn't see the big black engines anymore. You didn't see the smoke. You didn't hear the noise. And by the time the Little Red Caboose came, the children weren't there anymore. They didn't care. No one noticed the Little Red Caboose. And that went on and on. That was the story. That was the routine that happened day in, day out. But then one day, the train was climbing up this big hill, and it was an extra heavy train. It was an extra long train. And as the train started to go up this mountain outside the town, suddenly it got to a place where it was having trouble getting up the hill. And they stopped and actually started sliding backwards. And the big, strong black engines called out to the Little Red Caboose at the back of the train, saying, "Little Red Caboose, you have to help us. You have to put on your brakes. You have to hold tight to the rails. You are the only hope we have of not sliding backward down this mountain." And the Little Red Caboose tried, and it was holding onto that track, and it was trying to keep the train from sliding backwards down the mountain and creating a big mess. And it held on, and just when it think that it couldn't hold on anymore, other engines came behind the caboose, and they helped to push that train up over the hill. And the train was saved, and all of its cargo was saved. And from that day forward, in that town, whenever the train would come through, the children would come out, and they would wave at the big, strong black engines up front, and they would watch all the cars go by. But they saved their biggest cheers for the Little Red Caboose because the Little Red Caboose had saved the train. God deserves our biggest active response because he literally saved the world. If the children save their biggest cheers for the Little Red Caboose because it saved the train, our biggest response ought to be for God because he literally saved the entire world. It is only through him that salvation, that rescue from his righteous judgment is possible. God so loved the world that he sent his son Jesus so that anyone who believes in Jesus will not perish, will not be apart from God for the rest of eternity, but they can have eternal life. God deserves our biggest act of response because he saved the world, and he sent his son to save you. If the children could say their biggest cheers for the Little Red Caboose, you and I ought to save our biggest cheers, our biggest act of worship, our biggest act of response for the one who provided salvation. So, my friends, how do we do that? How do we worship this God? We jump back into Psalm 96, and we see several things. And yes, one of those, the first one, is singing. Singing is one means of worship, but it's not the only one. But Psalm 96, verse 1, it says, "Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord. Bless, give honor to his name. Tell of his salvation from day to day." Singing is one way that we demonstrate our worship, but also in this phrase here, there's a picture of this is something that happens regularly. So once again, this is not just something that happens on a Sunday morning. That is, we're thinking of God too small if we only give him 20 minutes of worship a week. There's an aspect of our time, of how we use our time, that is an act of worship. We actively respond to God's greatness by giving him our time on a day in, day out basis. In verse 3, there's this call to declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. Another way that we can worship God is to make sure that his name is known throughout all the world. And you and I personally, geographically, may not be able to do that. We may not be able to go everywhere ourselves, but one way that we can worship God, one way that we can actively respond to him is to support other believers in other countries who are telling their own people about God. It is an act of worship for us to support those who are committed to that throughout the entire world. Verse 7, ascribe, which is a word that we don't use very often, but it means to give, to demonstrate that we believe these things. Ascribe to the Lord what? Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. When internally, in our hearts, we think about God with an attitude of respect, of appreciation, of admiration, we recognize that he deserves all the glory. Another way we worship, Elsa talked about it earlier, is to bring an offering. That literally giving back to God a portion of all the financial resources that he has given to us, that is an act of worship. We worship as we give back to God. Come into his courts, worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness, tremble before him all the earth. Come into his courts, literally every single time we gather here, this is an act of worship. Coming together with others to give honor to the Lord, to respect him, to take a portion of our time, a portion of our weekend and say, Lord, you deserve this. You deserve so much more than this. But gathering and coming together is one way that we demonstrate that worship. Verse 10 says, say among the nations, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. We worship. It is an act of worship. It is an act of response when we talk about God's sovereignty, how he's in control, about how he is consistent, how he does not change, how he is that fair judge. We worship when we bring up God's faithfulness and his justice in conversations. There are many ways that we worship God. Out of all of those options of how we worship that Psalm 96 highlighted, which one stuck out the most to you? As we went through that list of singing, of time, of attitude, of financial offering, of gathering with other believers, of conversations, which one most grabbed your attention? Which is the one that maybe you realized, ooh, I don't know if I've thought about worship in that way. Or maybe you thought, I used to worship God in that way, and I haven't recently. And the Lord is convicting you that that's the way you can respond. Maybe all of this is brand new. You have no idea. You're just figuring out who God is and why he deserves that worship. But you look at these things and you think, maybe I should swap some of the time that I've spent actively responding to worshiping other things, those things we talked about earlier that disappoint. Maybe I ought to take a little bit of that and shift it and move it over to worship the Lord. Maybe as you think about these things, it's support of missionaries, of believers in other countries, where we realize, ooh, that's something that maybe the Lord is prompting me about. Maybe it's finding one new person this week to tell them the story of how God has changed your life. As Will did for us this morning, to share with them a story of hope, to demonstrate, to talk about, to proclaim God's glory by sharing with one person who you haven't done that with before about how good God has been to you. If you're not sure which one of those things, though, here's one simple thing, Fireside, that we can all do, that I would encourage us to consider. Each morning, pray this. If you're not sure what else to do, or if you're just looking for a summary statement that encompasses all these different types of worship, here's something we can do together. Pray this every single morning. God, help me today to actively respond, which is worship, to how valuable you are. Start each day by taking 20 seconds to pray, God, help me today, every day, to actively respond to how valuable you are. Personally, if I don't write something down, I don't remember it. If I don't set a reminder, it doesn't happen. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to invite you to do this with me, is to set a reminder in my phone that every morning, I think I'll do 8 a.m. Every morning at 8 a.m., to set a reminder on my phone that this shows up and prompts me to take 20 seconds to pause whatever I'm doing and just pray, God, help me today to actively respond to how valuable you are. So if you're like me, if you need that reminder, go ahead, do that. That's not cheating. God doesn't expect us to commit all these things and make a perfect plan and never fail, as we've been talking about with prayer, as we've been talking about with Bible reading, but to just set this reminder and pray this prayer and then to look for opportunities in that day to actively respond to how valuable He is. Why is that so important? If we don't flip our biggest worship to God, we're going to spend a lot of time chasing worthless things. And we're going to get disappointed. When that thing that we valued, that we've been actively responding to, when it disappoints us, because it will, when it fails us, because it will, we're going to be hurt, we're going to be discouraged. If we don't flip our biggest worship to God, we're going to be disappointed. But when we flip our biggest worship to God, we get to be joined by all of creation. And that's the last few verses we want to look at as we close. Psalm 96, verse 11 says this. It says, let the heavens be glad. Let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest, see those trees out there? The trees out the window? One day they're going to sing praises to God. All the trees of the forest will sing for joy before the Lord, for He comes. Friends, Jesus is coming back. What an opportunity we have now to worship Him with our voices, to worship Him with our lives, and one day all of creation is going to join in that chorus. And we will spend eternity, which is still not long enough, to give honor, to give praise to our great God. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing out together, and I want to close with one last challenge. When it comes to our singing, which is a very small one aspect of worship, sometimes when we sing about God's greatness, we sing, God, you're so good. God, you are so good. Let's sing even this morning with passion. Let's think about the words that we're saying. Let's think about how big God is. Let's respond to Him. He deserves our biggest response. Will you pray with me?